My husband locked me inside our smart home to frame me as insane while he took his mistress to the charity gala. He didn't realize the woman he just trapped was the only one who could destroy his entire empire. The elevator didn't feel like an elevator. It felt like a held breath. It dropped smooth and silent for 11 seconds. I counted them, because counting was the only thing keeping my hands from shaking. And then it opened onto a service tunnel my father had poured concrete for 19 years ago, back when he still thought the safest place for his daughter was somewhere no one could find her. Motion sensor lights kicked on in a slow blue wave, one after another, lighting a path toward a garage Blake had never once asked about, because Blake had never once asked me a real question in 8 years of marriage. At the end of the tunnel sat a 2011 Honda Civic. Gray, dented on the rear bumper, the kind of car nobody looks at twice in a parking lot full of Range Rovers. I called it the ghost car. I'd bought it with cash the year my father died, registered it under a name that wasn't legally a lie but wasn't the truth either, and I'd driven it exactly 11 times in 3 years. Always alone, always at night, always for reasons I never wrote down. Tonight made 12. I sat behind the wheel for a moment before I turned the key, and I let myself feel it. The specific, cold clarity that comes right before you do something you can never take back. Upstairs, my husband was somewhere over the causeway by now, Sloane's hand probably resting on his knee, both of them rehearsing how sad they'd sound tomorrow morning when they told the judge how concerned they were about me. He thought he'd locked a fragile woman in a smart home with her pills and her delusions. He had no idea he'd locked the chairwoman of Fairchild Capital in a house she owned outright, with a private elevator her own father had built, and a phone line that didn't run through any account with his name on it. My name is Arden Fairchild, not Whitfield. I have never, not for one single day of our marriage, been Arden Whitfield. I just let him believe the paperwork said otherwise, because for 8 years, believing that was the only way I could find out who actually loved me and who loved what I could give them. I met Blake the spring after my father's funeral, when I was 29 and drowning in a grief so total I couldn't stand to be looked at like an inheritance with a heartbeat. My father, Walton Fairchild, had built a firm that touched half the ports and half the real estate on this stretch of coast, and when he died of a heart attack at his desk at 4:40 in the morning, every cousin, every old family friend, every man in a good suit who'd ever shaken his hand at a fundraiser suddenly remembered how fond they'd always been of me. I stopped answering my phone. I moved into a studio apartment above a used bookstore on Calloway Street, my mother's maiden name, the one I used when I didn't want to be found, and I told myself I would just disappear for a year, shelve books, drink bad coffee, be nobody's daughter and nobody's asset. Blake found me in that bookstore on a Tuesday in April, soaked from a storm that had blown in off the Gulf, laughing at something absurd the owner had said about a shipment of water-damaged paperbacks. He was handsome in the unthreatening way. Good jaw, easy smile, a rumpled blazer that looked expensive without looking like it was trying to. He said he was scouting the block for a development project. He asked what I was reading. He didn't ask my last name for 6 weeks, and when he finally did, I gave him Calloway, and he never once looked it up. That was the first real thing I learned about Blake Whitfield. He didn't check. For a while, that felt like love. He courted the version of me that drove a rusted Corolla and split a $30 dinner bill down to the cent, and I let myself believe that a man who'd love a woman with nothing was a man who'd love the woman underneath everything. We married 11 months later at the county courthouse, just the two of us, and a witness he'd paid $20 to pull off the street. I told him afterward, gently in pieces, who my father had been. I watched something shift behind his eyes that I chose for years not to name. I should have named it that day. I've had a long time to sit with that. The first strange detail came 18 months into the marriage. Nothing, really. A charge on a card I didn't recognize. $412 at a restaurant across town on a night he'd told me he was working late at the Whitfield Ventures office. I told myself it was a client dinner. I told myself a lot of things in those years, and I got very good at it, because the alternative was admitting that the man who'd once memorized my coffee order now flinched when I touched his arm in public. The second detail came 3 years in, when Whitfield Ventures started chasing a project too big for a company its size. The Pier District redevelopment, a $46 million coastal contract that would either make Blake's name or bury it. He started coming home smelling like a stranger's perfume he swore was just the office. I found a receipt for a hotel room he said was a site visit. I told myself it was nothing, because by then I already knew that if I let myself believe it was something, I'd have to decide what to do about it, and I wasn't ready. The third detail I found by accident. On a laptop he'd left open on the kitchen counter while he showered, a draft document, unfinished, titled simply, Petition. I only read the first paragraph before I heard the water shut off upstairs, but the first paragraph was enough. Language about diminished capacity. Language about concern for her safety and the safety of others. My name, typed out cold and clinical, next to words like temporary guardianship and psychiatric evaluation recommended. I closed the laptop. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my coffee mug on the tile, and I told him it slipped. I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to him and listened to him breathe and understood, somewhere below language, that my husband was building a case against my mind the way other men build a case for a promotion. The fourth detail was a name, Dr. Elliot Reeves, on a business card I found tucked into the zipper pocket of Blake's gym bag, 3 weeks after the laptop. I looked him up the next morning at the bookstore, on the same laptop I used to keep the ledgers for my father's foundation. Reeves Behavioral Health, a small practice on Fairview with exactly one Google review, posted by someone whose name I recognized from a story 2 years earlier, a woman whose elderly father's entire estate had gone to a niece nobody had heard of. After Reeves diagnosed him with a cognitive disorder his own longtime physician said he never had. I sat very still in that bookstore for a long time, surrounded by other people's discarded stories, and I finally let myself say the sentence I'd been avoiding for months. My husband is trying to make people believe I'm losing my mind so he can take everything that's actually mine. The fifth thing I did wasn't rationalization. It was the first move I made that was smarter than his. I called Dana Whitcomb. Dana had been my father's trust attorney for 22 years, a small, sharp woman who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and had once made a room full of hedge fund lawyers apologize to each other before lunch. I told her everything, the receipts, the laptop, the business card, and she didn't gasp or comfort me. She opened a legal pad and started writing. If he tries to file an emergency petition, she said, the entire case rests on one thing, a diagnosis. He needs a doctor willing to say you're a danger to yourself. We're going to make sure the court has a second opinion before he ever gets the chance to file the first one. 11 days before the night Blake locked me in my own house, I sat across from Dr. Priya Nandan, a board-certified forensic psychiatrist with 12 years of experience, specifically in capacity evaluations for contested inheritance and guardianship cases. A woman who did nothing but untangle exactly the kind of lie my husband was building. She spent 3 hours with me. She asked about my sleep, my appetite, my relationships, my father's death, my marriage, my finances. At the end, she looked at me with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite respect, and she said, "There is nothing in this evaluation that would support an emergency intervention of any kind. I'll put that in writing, and I'll be available to testify to it in person if it ever comes to that." Dana filed the report under seal that same week, a preemptive strike sitting quietly in a court file Blake didn't know existed, waiting for the moment he was arrogant enough to walk into it. I told Graham Voss everything 2 days after that. Graham had been my father's director of family office security for 19 years, the man who'd once walked me down the aisle at my own wedding, because my father wasn't alive to do it. The man who still called me kid, even though I was 37 and ran a 9-figure trust. When I told him what Blake was planning, Graham didn't say a single word for almost a full minute. Then he said in the flattest voice I'd ever heard from him, "Let him try." That's when I asked him to do something I'd never asked anyone to do before. I asked him to let Blake believe he'd successfully bribed him. Blake had approached Graham 6 weeks earlier, a man he'd met exactly twice at industry events, a man he had no reason to trust, except that Graham's title made him sound like exactly the kind of person who could grease the wheels on a $46 million contract. Blake wired $2 million to an offshore account in exchange for what he believed would be inside information and a quiet word in the right ears at Fairchild Capital. Graham took the money, logged every transaction with Dana as a witness, and told Blake exactly what he wanted to hear. I hadn't known, that night in April, exactly when Blake would move against me. I'd only known he would, eventually, once Sloane's ambition and his own greed outran his patience. When Graham called me at 6:58 p.m. and told me the storm shutters were closing over a house he was watching on the security feed I didn't know he still had access to, some small exhausted part of me almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because I had been braced for this exact moment for 11 days, and some tired animal part of my brain was almost relieved that the waiting was finally over. I drove the ghost car out of the tunnel exit that led onto Bayshore Drive, 4 blocks from my own front gate, and I didn't look back at the house once. The storm shutters could stay down all night for all I cared. I wasn't going back in there until it belonged to me again in every way that mattered, not just on paper. Graham was waiting for me in the loading dock behind the Cortland Hotel, in a black SUV with the engine running, a garment bag draped over the back seat, and a leather folio on the passenger seat thick enough to break a man's. Graham was waiting for me in the loading dock behind the Cortland Hotel, in a black SUV with the engine running, a garment bag draped over the back seat, and a leather folio on the passenger seat thick enough to break a man's kneecap. He looked older than he had a month ago. He looked like he hadn't slept. "Dana's inside," he said, before I'd even shut the door. She got an emergency motion drafted 2 hours ago. If we can get it in front of a judge tonight or first thing before that 8 a.m. hearing, we kill his petition before he ever files it. And Reeves? Detective Lindqvist has had eyes on him for 4 months. Turns out your husband's not the first man to buy a diagnosis from that office. Graham handed me a printed photo. Dr. Elliot Reeves, mid-50s, silver-templed, standing outside his Fairview Avenue office next to a car that cost more than most people's houses. Fraud and financial crimes units had a pattern going back 3 years. Forged evaluations, kickbacks from families trying to steer inheritances. Your case just handed them the piece they were missing, a live petition in progress with your name on it. Where is she now? Lindqvist. 2 blocks over, in an unmarked car, waiting on my word. She wanted to be close in case Reeves shows up tonight looking for his money. I changed in the back of the SUV, in a hotel loading dock that smelled like diesel and old rain, out of the sweater I'd been wearing when my husband locked me in my own house, and into a dress that had been hanging in a garment bag in Graham's trunk for 11 days, waiting for a night I hoped I'd never actually need it. Dark green, structured, nothing like the soft, pale things Blake had always steered me toward. Things I understood now that were meant to make me look smaller than I was. Dana Whitcomb met us at the service entrance with a folder tucked under her arm and reading glasses pushed up into gray hair that had come loose from its clip. 22 years of practicing family and trust law had given her a face that didn't do surprise anymore, but even she looked a little rattled. He's inside, she said. Sloane's on his arm. Eleanor's holding court by the bar, telling anyone who'll listen how relieved she is that Blake's finally taking his wife's health seriously. Dana's mouth twisted. And your board is exactly where you asked them to be. 7 of 9, front row, expecting Marcus to make a keynote announcement about the Pier District contract at 9. Does Marcus know? Marcus has known who you really are since the day your father hired him to be the face you didn't want to be. He's ready whenever you are. I looked at the folio in Graham's hands, the recorded call where Blake had offered him $2 million for information he never should have had access to. The printed screenshots of the storm shutters closing over every window of my own house, time-stamped, pulled from the same security feed Blake thought only he controlled. Dr. R. Nandan's sealed evaluation, ready to be unsealed the moment it mattered. A photograph of Sloane's phone, held up by a member of the catering staff Graham had quietly put on retainer 2 weeks earlier, showing a video file labeled simply Evidence Arden for petition, recorded from a kitchen island, while I knelt on marble, cleaning up glass I hadn't broken. My stomach dropped reading that label, not because it surprised me, because it confirmed something I hadn't wanted to be true, that Chloe, my husband's 23-year-old daughter, the girl I'd taught to drive stick shift in a church parking lot, the girl who used to fall asleep on the couch with her head on my shoulder during thunderstorms, had been standing in my kitchen tonight with a phone in her hand, filming me, and I didn't yet know whether she understood what she was building a case for. I have 11 hours before that hearing, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. I want this finished before it ever gets a courtroom. Dana nodded once, sharp. Then let's go make him wish he'd checked your last name. The Magnolia Ballroom at the Cortland Hotel holds 400 people comfortably, and tonight it looked full. String quartet in the corner, a raw bar stretching the length of one wall, a banner overhead announcing the Pier District Redevelopment Initiative in gold script, $46 million worth of ambition dressed up as a party. I stood in the service hallway outside the ballroom doors for exactly 90 seconds, watching through the gap where the door hadn't fully latched, and I let myself look at my husband one more time as the man I'd married instead of the man I now knew him to be. He stood near the center of the room in a black tux that fit him better than his marriage vows ever had, Sloane's hand resting on his forearm, both of them laughing at something a state senator had said. Eleanor was 3 feet away, champagne flute in hand, telling a cluster of women in beaded dresses something that made her press a hand to her chest in performed sympathy. I didn't need to hear the words to know whose name was in that sentence. And there, near the dessert table, alone, scrolling through her phone with an expression I couldn't quite read, was Chloe. My hands weren't shaking anymore. That surprised me more than anything else that night. Somewhere between the elevator and the ballroom door, the fear had burned itself down into something colder and steadier, something that felt less like panic and more like arrival. Marcus Doyle found the microphone at 8:52 p.m., 8 minutes ahead of schedule, and I understood immediately that Graham had gotten a message to him. Marcus had run the public-facing side of Fairchild Capital for 6 years, tall and silver at the temples, a voice built for boardrooms, and he'd known exactly who signed his employment contract from the very first interview. He tapped the microphone twice, and the room's chatter folded down into an expectant hush. Before we get to tonight's announcement, Marcus said, I want to do something Fairchild Capital hasn't done in this ballroom in 3 years. I want to introduce the person actually sitting at the head of this table. I watched Blake's smile falter, just slightly, the way a man's smile falters when a joke goes on, a beat too long. Sloane's grip on his arm tightened. Eleanor's champagne flute paused halfway to her lips. I walked through the ballroom doors at 8:53 p.m., and 400 people turned to look at a woman most of them had never seen a photograph of in their lives, because I had spent 9 years making very sure no photograph existed. Most of you know me as a name on a trust document, I said, once I'd reached the small stage beside Marcus, my voice carrying farther than I expected in a room gone that silent. Some of you have done business with my father. A few of you have done business with me and never known it. My name is Arden Fairchild. I am the majority shareholder and chair of the Fairchild Family Trust, and as of 9 minutes ago, I am also a woman my husband attempted to have declared legally incompetent so he could take control of assets he was never entitled to in the first place. The gasp that moved through that room wasn't performance. I've thought about that a lot since. How you can tell the difference between the sound of people being scandalized for sport and the sound of people genuinely realizing the ground has shifted under them. This was the second kind. Blake's face did something I will remember for the rest of my life. It wasn't guilt. Not at first. It was arithmetic. The specific look of a man rapidly recalculating 8 years of assumptions in real time and watching every column come up negative. Sloane's hand slid off his arm like it had gone cold. Arden, he said my name like a question, like he was checking whether the woman standing on that stage was really the same one he'd locked behind storm shutters 2 hours ago. What is this? This, I said, is the part where I tell 400 witnesses, 3 journalists, and my entire board exactly what happened in my house tonight before I came here. I didn't shout. I want that understood, because I've watched enough of these moments play out in other people's stories to know how tempting it is to imagine yourself screaming, finally, everything you've swallowed for years. I didn't scream. I spoke the way my father used to speak in board meetings, level and unhurried, and it turned out that was so much worse for Blake than shouting would have been, because shouting is something you can dismiss as hysteria, and calm is something you can't. I told them about the bowl that didn't fall by accident. I told them about the phone Blake didn't know I had, and the storm shutters, and the 4 words he'd mouthed through a sliver of closing glass. I nodded to Graham, standing near the ballroom's side entrance with the folio open in his hands, and he stepped forward to hand a single printed page to Marcus, who read it aloud without a flicker of hesitation. A draft petition dated 3 weeks earlier, my name typed cold beside the words temporary guardianship, pulled from a laptop that had never once occurred to Blake I might have quietly mirrored. You broke into my computer, Blake said, and it was the wrong thing to say, in front of the wrong 400 people, because it wasn't a denial. It was an admission dressed up as an accusation. I've been married to you for 8 years, I said. I know your passwords because you never once thought I was smart enough to use them. Talia Cho had her phone out by then, recording, her press badge from the Gulf Coast Business Journal catching the ballroom light, and I watched 3 other phones rise around the room to join hers. I didn't stop them. I'd stopped being afraid of being watched the moment I understood that being watched, tonight, was the entire point. Dana Whitcomb stepped up beside me next, folder in hand, and read into the record, because that's what it was now, a record, the existence of a sealed independent psychiatric evaluation, conducted 11 days prior by Dr. Priya Nandan, board-certified in forensic psychiatry, finding no basis whatsoever for any claim of diminished capacity. She read the name of the physician Blake had allegedly retained instead, Dr. Elliot Reeves, of Reeves Behavioral Health, and a ripple moved through the crowd, because it turned out at least 2 other people in that ballroom recognized the name from stories of their own. That was when Detective Mara Lindqvist walked in through the same service entrance Graham had used, in plain clothes, badge already out, flanked by 2 uniformed officers who stayed politely near the door instead of storming the stage like something out of television. 14 years in the something out of television. 14 years in the Financial Crimes Unit had taught her, I think, exactly how much quiet authority a badge held up at shoulder height could carry in a room like this one, without a single raised voice. Dr. Reeves is currently the subject of an active fraud investigation involving at least 6 other falsified capacity evaluations tied to contested guardianship and inheritance cases going back 3 years. Detective Lindqvist said, addressing Marcus and Dana more than the room at large, though every word of it carried. We'll be executing a warrant on his office within the hour. This evening's events and any documentation Mrs. Fairchild's counsel can provide will be relevant to that case. This is insane, Blake said, and I watched him reach instinctively for the one word he'd been counting on using against me all along, and watched it land in that ballroom with the exact opposite weight he intended. No, I said. Insane was you telling 400 people I broke a crystal bowl out of clumsiness when your girlfriend clipped my elbow on purpose and your daughter filmed it for a court petition. I hadn't meant to say that last part yet. I saw Chloe's face before I finished the sentence. Saw her go the color of the tablecloths. Saw her phone slip out of her hand and clatter onto the parquet floor. Saw 23 years of being a fairly good kid crash headfirst into the discovery that she'd spent tonight collecting ammunition for something she hadn't fully understood. Sloane had told her it was for insurance, Chloe would tell me later, sobbing in a hotel stairwell while her father was being escorted out through a side door. Insurance in case Arden ever tried to claim Blake had mistreated her. Nothing more sinister than that. And Chloe, 23 and wanting badly to believe her father was a good man having a hard year, hadn't asked the follow-up questions she should have. I believed her. I want that on the record too, because not every person standing in the wreckage of someone else's lie is equally guilty of building it. Sloan orchestrated. Blake conspired. Eleanor cheered from the sidelines because she'd never liked me and had finally found a socially acceptable reason to say so out loud. Chloe was 23 years old and desperate to believe her father, and there's a difference between being fooled and being complicit, even when the footage looks the same from the outside. Marcus Doyle didn't wait for the rest of the room to settle before he did the thing I'd actually walked in there to make happen. He picked the microphone back up, and in the same even voice he'd have used to announce a quarterly earnings call, he said, "In light of this evening's events, Fairchild Capital is withdrawing from all active contract negotiations with Whitfield Ventures, effective immediately. $46 million gone in one sentence in front of every investor, board member, and journalist who mattered on that stretch of coast." I watched it land on Blake's face like a physical blow, watched him understand in real time that he hadn't just lost his wife's cooperation, he'd lost the one deal his entire company had been built around for the last 18 months. In the same room, on the same night, in front of every person whose good opinion he'd need to survive it. Sloan didn't wait to see how the rest of it played out. She was gone from the ballroom within 4 minutes, though it wouldn't matter. Whitfield Ventures fired her by email before the following evening, once their board realized exactly what documenting a spouse for a fraudulent guardianship petition might expose the company to in a civil suit. And a separate letter arrived from their outside counsel 2 weeks later, informing her she was also named in a criminal referral for conspiracy and unlawful surveillance, filed by Dana Whitcomb on my behalf, based on a Florida statute that makes it a crime to secretly record someone inside their own home without consent. 2 uniformed officers stayed close to Blake for the rest of that night, not to arrest him, not yet, Detective Lindqvist told me quietly, because the warrant they needed to move on the attempted guardianship fraud charge wasn't finalized until the paperwork from Dana's office and Dr. Nandan's report cleared a judge's desk the following morning, but to make very sure he didn't leave the state before it did. He left the Cortland Hotel a little after 10 that night through a side entrance, past a small cluster of photographers Talia Cho's paper had apparently tipped off sometime around 9:15, and the photo that ran the next morning showed a man in a $5,000 tuxedo looking like he'd aged a decade walking to his car alone. He was arrested 6 days later at his own office on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud and attempted unlawful deprivation of liberty, a felony charge built on the draft petition, the forged intent to falsify a diagnosis, and a locked house with the storm shutters still on record from a security company that, it turned out, kept its own independent logs Blake had never thought to ask about. Dr. Elliot Reeves was arrested that same week in the middle of what turned out to be his 7th fraudulent capacity evaluation for an entirely unrelated family, and lost his medical license 9 weeks later after the state board reviewed a pattern going back 3 years that Detective Lindqvist's unit had finally assembled into something a prosecutor could use. I filed for divorce the following Monday. Dana had drafted the paperwork 2 weeks before that ballroom, the same way she'd drafted everything else. Ready, waiting, refusing to be surprised by a man who'd spent 8 years assuming none of the women in his life were paying close enough attention to plan ahead of him. The prenuptial agreement Blake had insisted on, back when he still believed I was the one marrying up, turned out to contain a fraud clause he'd had his own lawyer draft to protect himself from a wife who might someday try to take him for more than he was worth. That same clause, once the conspiracy charges were filed, worked in exactly the opposite direction he'd intended, stripping him of any claim to marital assets and leaving him personally liable for the $2 million he'd wired to Graham as a bribe. Since a court doesn't consider criminal payments a protected marital expense, the house was never really his to lose in the end. It had sat in the Fairchild Family Trust since before I married him, a detail his own name on the mailbox had never changed no matter how many times he told me otherwise. Eleanor stopped returning invitations to anything hosted by anyone who'd been in that ballroom. I heard secondhand that she moved to Georgia to be near a different brother 8 months later, and I found I didn't feel anything at all when I heard it, which was its own kind of closure. Chloe called me 11 days after the gala, her voice small and cracked in a way I hadn't heard since she was 14 and her mother had first left. She didn't ask for forgiveness right away. She asked if she could come by the bookstore on Callaway Street, the one I still owned, quietly, the one I still stopped into some mornings just to stand among the shelves and remember who I'd been before any of this. We sat in the back room for 2 hours while she cried and apologized, and told me things about her father I suspect she'd known, on some buried level, for longer than she wanted to admit. I didn't promise her instant trust. I told her the truth, which was that I believed she hadn't understood what she was part of, and that believing that was different from forgetting it, and that we'd have to see, together, slowly, what came next. She's still finding out what that looks like. So So am I. I gave a statement to the state legislature 4 months later at a hearing on guardianship and conservatorship reform that Dana had helped organize, sitting at a table with 2 other women whose husbands had tried the exact same scheme with less money and less luck. I told a room full of lawmakers about a doctor with 1 Google review and a business card in a gym bag zipper pocket, about a laptop left open on a kitchen counter, about how easy it is, if you have the right amount of money and the right amount of contempt for the person you married, to build a legal case for someone else's madness out of nothing but paperwork and a bribed signature. The bill that came out of that session tightened the requirement for independent evaluation before any emergency petition could be filed. It won't fix everything. It's something. I still own the ghost car. I drive it more than I used to. Actually, not to hide anymore, but because there's a particular kind of peace in sitting behind a cracked steering wheel in a gray Honda Civic nobody looks at twice, knowing that for the first time in 9 years, I don't need it to disappear into. I use it because I like it, which is its own small, strange kind of freedom. Marcus still runs the public side of Fairchild Capital, though these days I show up to more of the meetings myself, under my own name, in rooms full of people who now know exactly whose signature has been on the real decisions all along. Graham still calls me kid. Dana still wears her reading glasses on that same beaded chain. I keep Dr. Nandan's report in a drawer in my office not because I need it anymore, but because I like being reminded that I was smart enough, and scared enough, and stubborn enough to get ahead of a man who spent 8 years assuming I'd never see it coming. Blake pled guilty to a reduced charge 14 months later, in exchange for a sentence that still cost him his license to operate as a licensed contractor in this state, and 3 years of probation he's currently serving somewhere I make a point of not knowing. Whitfield Ventures folded 8 months after the gala, once its remaining clients read the same headlines everyone else did. I heard he's selling boats now, somewhere up near Pensacola, under his own name for once, because there was no one left willing to be misled by it. I think about that forward message sometimes. Take your pills, Arden. Mouthed through a sliver of closing glass by a man who thought he was watching a door shut on the rest of my life. He wasn't wrong exactly. He just had the direction backward. Mouthed through a sliver of closing glass by a man who thought he was watching a door shut on the rest of my life. He wasn't wrong exactly. He just had the direction backward. He locked the wrong woman in the wrong house, and it turned out the only thing he'd successfully sealed shut that night was his own.